You know, for as long as human beings have existed, we always had this concept of the campfire.
Right, yeah.
Like we sit together in the warmth and the light, and we just stare out into the darkness, knowing there is something dangerous out there, something that simply doesn't follow our rules.
Oh, absolutely. It's the absolute unknown. I mean, that primal fear of the predator in the dark is just hardwired into us.
It really is. And for most of human history, when we tried to draw a picture of what was actually out there in that darkness, we drew literal monsters.
Fangs, claws, the whole thing.
Exactly. But today, the monsters we're so obsessed with, they don't have fangs, they wear suits, they mow their lawns, they smile at us in the grocery store.
Which is arguably much more terrifying.
So much more. And that's why today, we're taking you on a deep dive into this massive, multi-layered dossier from Psychology Today. It explores the dark, incredibly complex world of serial killers.
And it is a subject that completely saturates our culture right now. I mean, you turn on any streaming service, you browse any bookstore, and they are front and center. But what's really alarming is how much of what we think we know about them is actually just, well, a comforting fiction.
Which is exactly our mission for you today.
Right.
We're going to cut through all that sensationalized Hollywood noise.
Yeah.
You want to understand the actual psychological mechanisms behind these individuals. And ultimately, we're going to turn the mirror right back onto you, the listener, to figure out why we as a society are so completely, undeniably obsessed with them. Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
To really understand our modern true crime obsession, we first have to look at how we historically define these individuals, right?
Right.
Because they didn't just suddenly appear out of nowhere in the 1970s.
Far from it. That campfire analogy you used perfectly illustrates the historical context provided in the research. If you go back to ancient and medieval times, long before the term serial killer was ever uttered, these individuals were committing these horrific acts. But society lacked any sort of clinical or psychological framework to process what was happening. So how did they cope? They created mythology. They labeled them as werewolves or vampires or, people possessed by demonic forces.
I suppose if a human being is committing acts of such profound, repetitive violence, it shatters the social contract entirely. It's almost easier for a medieval village to just say, a literal monster did this, rather than face the terrifying reality that the blacksmith or the baker is slaughtering people for fun.
Yeah, that is the exact psychological defense mechanism at play. Blaming the supernatural externalizes the threat. Even when we fast forward to the late 19th century with Jack the Ripper, who historians often point to as the first modern serial killer, because of how the press covered him, that specific term still didn't exist.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It wasn't until the 1970s and 80s that the phrase serial killer was popularized. That shift happened largely because of the FBI's behavioral science unit, advanced law enforcement tracking, and just an absolute explosion of mass media attention.
But the media uses these terms completely interchangeably today, which I found so frustrating when reading the dossier. Psychology is incredibly strict about the definition.
Very strict.
To clinically be classified as a serial killer, an individual has to murder at least 3 people over a period of more than a month. But the crucial detail, the thing that really separates them, is the cooling off period between the kills.
Yeah, that cooling off period is the entire foundation of how we study them. It is the defining behavioral metric that separates a serial killer from, say, a mass murderer.
Like a school shooter or someone who attacks a public event.
Yes, exactly. A mass murderer commits all their violence in a brief, single, explosive event. They don't stop until they are caught, killed, or take their own life. It's an unbroken chain of violence.
And a serial killer is different.
Completely different. A serial killer operates on an extended timeline. They commit a murder, and then the psychological tension releases. They retreat back into society. They go back to work.
Just normal life.
Yeah, they attend family dinners. Days, weeks, or even years can elapse before the urge builds up again and they strike.
I have to offer a bit of philosophical pushback here, though.
Okay.
Did we ever actually stop believing in monsters? Because looking at how we talk about them today, it feels like medieval villagers blaming werewolves and modern society throwing around the term pure evil are basically doing the exact same thing. We're still just throwing our hands up, trying to make sense of inexplicable violence.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you're hitting on the exact reason why establishing that clinical definition, specifically the cooling off period, was so vital for modern psychology.
How so?
Focusing on that downtime forces us to stop throwing our hands up. It moves law enforcement away from that supernatural panic and into actual behavioral science, because the immediate question becomes what on earth is happening in their brain during that downtime? What flips the switch from normal neighbor back to predator?
Oh, I see where you're going. Because the cooling off period proves they have impulse control.
Right.
They aren't in a constant, uncontrollable state of frenzy like a rabid animal. They are making a calculated choice to stop and then a calculated choice to start again, which drives us right into their motives. Why do they start again?
Understanding the why is how we dismantle that idea of inexplicable evil. The Psychology Today research categorizes the root drivers into 4 primary psychological profiles. And they operate very differently. Some are driven by external delusions, while others are driven by internal gratification.
Let's look at the external ones first. The dossier talks about the visionary killer, which seems to be the rarest. These individuals genuinely believe they are being commanded to kill by God, demons, or other entities.
Yeah, that's the one category where you actually see severe psychosis or a condition like unmedicated schizophrenia at play. They are experiencing profound auditory or visual hallucinations. Closely related to that, but slightly more grounded in reality, is the mission-oriented killer.
These are the people who feel a twisted moral duty to rid the world of a specific demographic, right? Like someone who exclusively targets sex workers or a specific minority group, genuinely believing they are somehow cleaning up society.
Yes, the motive is ideological, however warped it may be. But then we shush to the internal drivers, which are far more common.
Okay.
The hedonistic killers derive acute, tangible pleasure from the act. For many, that pleasure is highly sexualized, but for others, it's a pure thrill-seeking adrenaline rush.
Which is terrifying.
It is. And finally, you have those driven by power and control. For them, the physical act of murder is almost secondary to the psychological high of having absolute domination over whether another human being lives or dies.
Wait, I struggle with this. Looking at those extreme motives, especially the hedonistic and power-driven ones, if they are committing acts of such horrific violence, aren't they legally insane by definition? I thought that was a massive part of criminal defense, but the sources say extremely few are deemed legally insane.
It's a very common misconception. Legal insanity doesn't just mean you did something crazy or horrific. The legal threshold, often based on the Amnaten rule, requires that the person literally did not know the nature of their actions, or they didn't know that what they were doing was wrong.
So the visionary killer hallucinating demons might qualify.
Potentially.
Yeah.
But the overwhelming majority of serial killers rarely suffer from complete breaks with reality. Instead, what we're looking at is extreme antisocial personality disorder.
Like psychopathy.
Exactly. Severe psychopathy and sociopathy. A psychopath knows exactly what they are getting is wrong according to the law and society. They simply do not care.
Right.
They possess a terrifying cognitive empathy, meaning they understand how you are feeling, which is how they manipulate you, but they lack any actual emotional empathy. They are entirely incapable of genuine remorse.
Which brings up the oldest debate in psychology. Nature versus nurture. Are they born this way or are they made? Do you just get a bad roll of the genetic dice or does society create them?
The research emphasizes that it's almost never just one or the other. It is a fatal, catastrophic combination of the two. The biological component is undeniable. Antisocial personality disorder and severe psychopathy have significant genetic roots. You can look at brain scans and see distinct differences in the amygdala, which processes fear and empathy.
Wow.
But having that genetic marker doesn't automatically mean someone will become a serial killer.
Let me run an analogy by you based on how the dossier explained this.
Mm-hmm.
If we think about their genetics as a corrupted hard drive, is the childhood trauma basically the malicious software that actually executes the program?
Oh, I like that. What's fascinating here is how perfectly that analogy maps to the clinical reality. Having the biological predisposition of the corrupted hard drive just means the vulnerability is there. There are plenty of people with antisocial traits or low empathy who never commit a crime.
Really?
Yeah, they channel that ruthlessness elsewhere. They become aggressive stockbrokers, high-stakes CEOs, or brilliant surgeons who don't get emotionally attached to their patients.
But when you introduce the malicious software, when a child with that vulnerable hardware experiences severe abuse, extreme neglect, or profound psychological trauma.
That's the environmental trigger. The software installs. The trauma interacts with the genetic lack of empathy, and that homicidal program executes. It creates an individual who uses violence as their primary coping mechanism and feels no guilt doing it.
Because that program runs so quietly in the background, they can hide in plain sight. They learn to mimic normal human behavior. The dossier talks about Jamie Gehring, who grew up right next door to the Unabomber in rural Montana. She played in his yard as a child.
Yeah, she said he was odd, but she never saw the danger hiding there.
Or look at how the public is currently trying to comprehend the psychology of modern accused killers like Brian Koberger. The sheer mundane normality they project in their daily lives is what makes it so chilling.
And because that reality is so deeply unsettling, the idea that the friendly neighbor you wave to could be harboring these violent urges, pop culture has stepped in as a coping mechanism. To make us feel better, Hollywood has filled in the gaps with these comforting, simplified myths.
I'm not sure I'd call Hollywood serial killers comforting. They give me nightmares.
They do, but in a strange way, fiction gives them rules. It gives them obvious, recognizable traits. If the monster has rules, we can outsmart the monster. And that brings us to the necessity of systematically dismantling these fictional tropes using empirical data, because the myths are actually making us less safe.
Okay, let's tear down the biggest one first. The evil genius myth. Because of pop culture, we all picture Anthony Hopkins as Hannibal Lecter. We imagine this hyper-intelligent, sophisticated mastermind listening to classical music and playing 4D chess with the police. But the data from the FBI and behavioral scientists says absolutely not.
Not even close. Most serial killers fall strictly on an average IQ spectrum. Some are even well below average. They aren't evading the police for years because they are criminal masterminds outsmarting the system.
Then how do they get away with it for so long?
Opportunism and marginalization. They often evade the police because they prey on vulnerable groups that society, unfortunately, ignores: transients, sex workers, runaways, or they just get lucky by crossing county or state lines, exploiting the lack of communication between different police jurisdictions. It's not genius, it's predatory calculation mixed with a flawed system.
That makes total sense. Then there's the famous McDonald triad. You hear about this on every single true crime show.
Oh yeah, the triad of evil.
Right. The early warning signs in childhood: animal cruelty, fire setting, and chronic bedwetting past an appropriate age.
It's a concept that originated in the 1960s, and the theory behind it wasn't completely baseless at the time. The idea was that chronic bedwetting caused persistent, deep childhood shame and isolated the child from their peers. That isolation led to a rich, dark fantasy life. Fire setting was seen as an early attempt to exert control over a chaotic environment through destruction.
In the animal cruelty.
That was the practice run, a safe way to express violent urges without the risk of fighting a human.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The Psychology Today research points out that modern psychology heavily debates this triad. It is not universally present in serial killers, and plenty of kids who experience trauma might wet the bed or act out without ever becoming violent offenders.
Right.
So I have to ask, are we just placing way too much faith in these checklists because we desperately want a foolproof way to spot a killer before they strike? Are we just desperate for an early warning system?
This raises an important question about human psychology and confirmation bias. If we have a checklist, we have the illusion of control. If we believe all serial killers are dysfunctional male loners with genius IQs who wet the bed and tortured cats as kids, we feel safer.
Because they stand out.
Exactly. We can look at our average intelligence neighbor who has a wife, 2 kids, and a golden retriever and say, well, he doesn't fit the profile. My family is safe.
But the reality shatters that comfort. Look at the BTK killer, Dennis Rader. He wasn't a drifter. He was a married father, a Cub Scout leader, and the president of his church council.
Accepting that they are intensely average people deeply embedded in our communities is far more terrifying than believing in an exotic evil genius.
Which leads us to maybe the biggest demographic myth of all, the gender myth.
Ah, yes.
When we talk about serial killers, society assumes they are exclusively male. But the dossier clearly states that women make up roughly 15% of all documented serial killers. That's a massive statistical chunk that nobody talks about.
And the reason we ignore that 15% is entirely due to societal stereotypes. We culturally view women as inherently nurturing, empathetic, or submissive. That ingrained bias creates a massive blind spot, not just for the general public, but historically for law enforcement and judges as well.
The dossier highlights that their modus operandi, their MO, is usually what keeps them off the radar. Female serial killers are rarely driven by the hedonistic or sexual motives that drive male killers. They tend to kill for resources.
Right. Financial gain, life insurance, or property.
And they use significantly less messy methods. Men tend to rely on brute force shooting, stabbing, or strangling. Women overwhelmingly favor poison.
Let's look at the mechanism of that choice. Poison doesn't require physical dominance. Furthermore, the symptoms of poisoning, nausea, organ failure, respiratory distress often perfectly mimic natural illnesses like a heart attack or severe flu.
So they just slip under the radar?
Exactly. A doctor signs off on a natural death certificate and the killer goes completely undetected. Additionally, female killers often act in concert with a dominant male partner, manipulating the situation from the background. The research highlights brutal historical cases like Carla Homolka acting alongside Paul Bernardo in Canada or Myra Hindley with Ian Brady in the UK.
Yet when the media does finally catch a female serial killer acting completely alone, they distort her story to fit a narrative. Look at Eileen Wuornos in the 90s. The media loved to crown her as the queen of serial killers. They made movies about her. But the experts in the dossier argue that title is completely misleading and just further obscures the truth.
It is misleading. Compared to other historical killers, her psychological profile and her victim count don't actually stand out in the way the media portrays. She didn't use poison. She shot her victims. She was a sex worker who claimed self-defense initially.
Right.
The media turned her into a circus simply because she broke the traditional gender stereotype so loudly and violently. It was sensationalism, pure and simple.
The sheer volume of these myths, the sophisticated evil genius, the rigid childhood checklists, the absolute blindness to female killers, all of it generated by pop culture, brings us to what is perhaps the most uncomfortable realization of this entire deep dive.
We have to turn the mirror around.
We do. We have to look at our own ravenous appetite for this dark content. I was actually a little embarrassed by how many true crime documentaries I realized I consumed while I was prepping for this discussion. We have to ask why you, the listener, are tuning into this deep dive right now, or why true crime shows dominate the charts year after year.
It's the multi-million-dollar question. Are we fundamentally broken or morbidly sick for wanting to consume this?
So what does this all mean? The great news from the psychologists in the dossier is, no, you aren't broken. Having a fascination with evil is not inherently psychologically unhealthy. In fact, our brains are biologically programmed to pay attention to calamity.
Think about it from a strict evolutionary biology perspective. The early humans who paid close attention to the rustling in the bushes, the threat, the predator, the calamity, were the ones who survived to pass on their genes.
Wow, yeah.
The ones who ignored the dark were eaten. We are quite literally wired to study the predator.
It's a biological fire drill. We are obsessively studying the smoke in these articles and documentaries so we know exactly when to run from the fire. Plus, consuming this media gives us a safe adrenaline rush. We get to experience the fear, the horror, and the tension of the hunt, but we get to do it sitting on our couch with the doors locked. It's a perfectly controlled environment.
There is also the profound concept of knowledge as armor. Because we just established that these killers appear so normal until they are caught, learning their methods and understanding their psychology gives us a false but comforting sense of security.
Right, like if we study them, we're safe.
Exactly. It makes us feel like if we just memorize the warning signs, we won't be caught unawares. By staring into the abyss of true crime, we are actually seeking reassurance about our own safety. We are trying to manage the ultimate unknown.
I understand the survival aspect, but the dossier tackles the absolute extreme end of this fascination, which I find genuinely baffling. Hybristophilia.
Yeah.
This is the phenomena of women who fall in love with, write letters to, and even marry convicted serial killers who are already sitting on death row. How does evolutionary biology explain that?
It's a shocking phenomenon, and the psychological mechanisms behind it are layered. For some of these women, it's a warped manifestation of the desire to nurture. They look at that malicious software of childhood abuse we talked about earlier, and they arrogantly believe their love is the cure.
They think they can fix them.
Exactly. They think they can retroactively fix the broken little boy hiding inside the monster.
That seems incredibly dangerous.
It is. For others, it's extreme fanaticism, treating these men like dark celebrities to gain adjacent fame. But you asked about evolutionary biology. There is a controversial theory that somewhere deep in our lizard brain, there is a primal drive to align with the most dominant or lethal mate in the environment for ultimate protection.
If you are with the apex predator, nothing else can hurt you.
Precisely. Hybristophilia is that evolutionary drive taken to its absolute, most toxic, misfiring extreme.
That is deeply unsettling. But sociologically speaking, the experts suggest these killers actually end up serving a very dark but functional role for society as a whole, which blew my mind.
It sounds counterintuitive, but think about how gray human morality often is. We argue over what is right and wrong, ethical and unethical, every single day. The lines are blurry.
Very blurry.
But a serial killer's behavior is so indisputably despicable, so universally abhorrent, that it draws a stark, unmovable boundary. They become the ultimate contrast. They unite society in condemnation, clarifying exactly what good and evil actually look like for the rest of us.
Which brings us full circle. We started this deep dive looking for monsters in the dark. We journeyed from the historical panics over werewolves and witches into the cold, clinical reality of the cooling-off period. We unpacked that fatal intersection where a corrupted genetic hard drive meets the malicious software of childhood trauma.
We dismantled the comforting Hollywood illusions, the myth of the evil genius, the flawed comfort of the McDonald triad, and our societal blind spots regarding female killers operating in plain sight.
And finally, we turn the mirror around to confront our own evolutionary fascination with calamity. So the next time you boot up a true crime documentary or read a sensational headline, remember, you aren't just engaging in morbid voyeurism.
No, not at all.
You are participating in an ancient human ritual. You're sitting at that campfire, peering into the dark, trying to comprehend the very boundaries of human nature.
And as we continue to push back that darkness with behavioral science, we are finding entirely new ways to track the predators. Which leaves us with one final fascinating thought from the research to take with you today.
Oh, right.
We all know killers leave behind physical DNA at crime scenes, but experts are now developing ways to track what they call linguistic fingerprints.
Linguistic fingerprints,
Yeah.
like how they talk.
Exactly. Criminals have unique, subconscious ways they use language. I'm talking about the frequency of specific pronouns, conjunctions, or sentence structures. These are deep-seated psychological patterns they don't even realize they have, and more importantly, patterns they cannot scrub away from ransom notes, manifestos, or digital communications.
Wow. It's revolutionizing how law enforcement catches them, because your syntax reveals your psychology.
Which leaves you to wonder if the subconscious words a killer uses can fundamentally betray their darkest secrets. What do the words you use every single day secretly reveal about who you really are? Thanks for joining us in the deep dive.